The rifle was already pressed against Rose Quinn's shoulder when Samuel Cooper rode onto her land. She did not lower it. Her arms were shaking, not from the weight of the Winchester, but from 3 days without a proper meal, from the blisters on both palms where she had gripped a shovel handle until her skin split open, from the rage that had been building inside her chest like steam with nowhere to go. The man in front of her, the wide-shouldered rancher with the sun-worn face and the steady dark eyes, sat easy in his saddle, as if a woman pointing a rifle at him was simply Tuesday business in 1884 Texas. "Get off my land," Rose said, and her voice did not shake the way her arms did. "Your land," the man repeated, and there was something in the way he said it that was not mockery. It was careful, like he was measuring the weight of those two words. "You are Rose Quinn, then?" "I am, and I will not say it again. Off." He raised both hands, slow, palms facing her, and she noticed his hands were the hands of a working man, scarred at the knuckles, dark from sun, strong in a way that was earned rather than inherited. "My name is Samuel Cooper," he said. "I own the 400 acres due east of this property. I have been watching this land sit empty for 8 months since your mother passed, and I came because I need to speak with you. People who need to speak with me send letters. I sent 3. The rifle wavered a fraction before she caught it again. She had received 3 letters. She had not opened any of them because she had assumed they were from Harlan Decker's lawyer, the same man who had been sending correspondence every 2 weeks since her mother, Clara Quinn, had taken her last breath in the back bedroom of the farmhouse Rose was currently standing in front of. The same lawyer who had been quietly, systematically trying to dismantle every legal protection her mother had put in place to keep this land safe. Rose lowered the rifle by 2 inches, not enough to be an invitation, enough to be an acknowledgement. "What do you want, Mr. Cooper?" "I want to tell you that Harlan Decker filed papers in the county seat 4 days ago," Samuel Cooper said, and his voice was flat and direct the way a man's voice gets when he is delivering news he knows will wound. "He is claiming your mother owed him an outstanding debt of $900 and that this land is collateral. The judge has given you 30 days to contest it or vacate." The rifle dropped all the way to her side. 30 days. Rose Quinn looked out at the land behind this man, the land her mother had broken her body working. The land that had been purchased with money Clara Quinn earned washing other people's clothing for 11 years in Missouri before she gathered her daughter and every cent she owned and came west because she believed, the way only desperate people believe things, that land of your own was the one thing in this world no one could take from you. Rose had come back to prove her mother right. Now she stood on the cracked Texas soil in the spring of 1884 with a nearly empty rifle, blistered hands, a farmhouse that needed more repairs than she could count, and 30 days to save everything. She looked at Samuel Cooper, and he looked back at her, and neither of them looked away. "Tell me everything you know," she said. She had arrived in Caldwell County 3 days earlier, riding the last 40 miles from the train station on a horse she had rented for 50 cents she could not spare. The journey from St. Louis had taken 6 days by rail, and she had spent most of those 6 days in the cheapest available seat, eating hard bread and watching Texas rise up out of the earth like something ancient and indifferent. She was 24 years old. She had been working as a seamstress in St. Louis for 2 years since her mother had first come west, sending money back each month and receiving letters full of hope and plain talk about the land, about the weather, about the 2 cows she had purchased, and the garden she was coaxing out of soil that had never been asked to produce before. The last letter had come 8 months ago. It was written in her mother's hand, but the letters were larger than usual, looser, and Rose had read it 3 times on the shop floor before she understood that her mother was not simply tired but sick. By the time she had saved enough to buy a train ticket and give proper notice to her employer, a telegram had arrived from the county sheriff informing her that Clara Quinn had died of pneumonia on November the 14th and had been buried in the churchyard in the town of Millhaven. Rose had wept for 2 days in her rented room. Then she had stood up, packed her single trunk, and started making arrangements. The land was hers. Clara had told her so in every letter, and the deed, a real legal deed in Clara Quinn's name, had been filed with the county before the ground even broke. Rose had a copy of the letter her mother's attorney had written confirming as much. She was the sole heir. She had a right. What she had not anticipated was Harlan Decker. She learned about him in pieces, the way you learn about a dangerous thing, gradually, from the way other people talked around it. She heard his name first from the woman at the general store in Millhaven, a Mrs. Abernathy, who had pressed her lips together in a thin line when Rose asked about the Quinn property, and said only that it was a complicated situation. She heard it again from the livery man who rented her the horse, and said, without looking directly at her, that there were powerful people in this county who had strong opinions about that particular stretch of land. She heard it a third time from the preacher who had performed her mother's burial service, who held her hands and looked genuinely sorry when he told her that Clara Quinn had not been the first person Harlan Decker had worked his way around. Decker owned the largest cattle operation in Caldwell County. He owned the bank in Millhaven. He was friendly, by all accounts, with the circuit judge. And he wanted the Quinn land because it sat directly between his eastern pasture and the creek that ran along the property's western boundary, a creek that was the most reliable water source for 40 miles in that direction. And without it, Decker's cattle operation would require him to sink 2 new wells at enormous expense. Clara Quinn had known this. She had known it from the beginning, and she had refused to sell at any price, and Rose understood now with perfect clarity why those last letters had been written in such large, loose handwriting. Her mother had not just been sick with pneumonia. She had been afraid. Samuel Cooper sat across from Rose at the small kitchen table inside the farmhouse, his hat in his hands, and he told her all of it plainly. He had watched Decker's operation from his own property for 3 years. He had seen 2 other small landowners in the county lose their property to variations of the same scheme: a manufactured debt, a sympathetic judge, a deadline too short for a person without resources to mount a proper legal defense. "Why are you telling me this?" Rose asked. Samuel looked at his hat. Then he looked up at her, and there was something in his expression she could not quite read. Not pity, not calculation. Something honest and slightly uncomfortable, like a man who had made a decision he was not entirely sure was wise but was committed to anyway. "Because your mother was a good neighbor," he said. "She brought me a pie the first week I arrived here. She never asked me for anything. She worked this land with everything she had, and she talked about you like you hung the moon, and I was not there when she needed help, and I am here now." Rose Quinn, who had not cried since those 2 days in her rented room in St. Louis, felt something move dangerously in her chest. She did not cry, but it was close. "What can be done?" she asked. "A few things. First, we need to find out if this debt is real or fabricated. Second, if we can get the right attorney and the right documentation together within 30 days, the claim can be contested. The problem is money. I have $42. Samuel nodded like this was not a surprise. "The attorney in Millhaven who handles property cases charges $60 for a full consultation and representation. Then we need a different plan." "There are other options," Samuel said. "I have some capital saved. And there are people in this county who do not love Decker, people who might be willing to step forward if they believed someone was actually going to fight him." Rose studied this man. He was, she estimated, around 30 years old, perhaps a year or 2 beyond. He was not handsome in any conventional, polished way, but there was a steadiness to him, a quality of stillness that she associated with people who had weathered genuine difficulty rather than just imagined it. He wore a plain work shirt and canvas trousers and boots that were good quality but well used. His ranch, she had noticed riding in, was modest but well maintained. The fences were tight. The outbuildings were sound. The kind of place a person builds by themselves over time with care rather than money. "Why would you spend your capital on my problem?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because if Decker gets your land, his cattle will have free run to the creek, and his herd will foul the water, and my property will suffer for it." It was a practical answer. It was possibly even partly true. But Rose Quinn had survived 24 years largely by being able to tell when a person was showing her only half their hand, and she filed this awareness away without comment. "All right," she said. "Tell me what we do first." What they did first was inventory. Rose spent the following morning walking every inch of her mother's property with a notebook and a stubby pencil, making a list of everything that existed and everything that needed doing. Samuel arrived at 7 o'clock with coffee in a tin pot and 2 biscuits wrapped in a cloth, and he handed them over matter-of-factly and asked if he could walk with her, and she said yes, because she was practical enough to know that she needed help and proud enough to want it to feel like a partnership rather than charity. The Quinn property was 60 acres. Not enormous, but not small either. There was the farmhouse, which had a sagging porch and a window with a cracked pane and walls that needed fresh daubing in 3 places, but was fundamentally sound. There was a barn that needed its roof patched on the north side. There were 2 fields that had not been planted and would need to be turned before the season advanced too far. There was a vegetable garden behind the house that was overgrown but salvageable. And there was the creek, running clear and cold along the western edge of the property, lined with cottonwood trees that were just beginning to show their new spring leaves in pale, fragile green. Standing at the edge of the creek, Rose understood immediately why Decker wanted this land. The water was beautiful. It was the kind of water that changed everything around it, made things possible that would not otherwise be possible. She stood looking at it for a long moment while Samuel stood a few feet away, giving her space in a way she appreciated more than she said. "My mother loved this," Rose said, not quite meaning to say it aloud. "She used to sit here in the evenings," Samuel said. "I could see her from my ridge sometimes, just sitting." Rose looked at him. "You watched her." "Not like that," he said, and a faint color moved across his weathered face that surprised her. "I just noticed." "The way you notice things about your neighbors." She let it go. "Tell me about the debt claim. What exactly did Decker file?" Samuel explained as they walked back toward the house. The claim was for $900, allegedly loaned to Clara Quinn in the autumn of 1882 to purchase livestock and improve the property. The documentation Decker had filed showed a promissory note signed by Clara. The problem was that the note looked genuine, or at least it would to a judge who was not looking too closely. "Did my mother ever mention a loan?" Rose asked. "Not to me, and I spoke with her regularly." "Then either she took a loan she kept secret from everyone, which does not match anything I know about her, or that note is a forgery." "That is exactly what I believe," Samuel said. "Can it be proved?" "Possibly. Your mother kept records." She was meticulous about paperwork because she knew, being a woman and being without a husband, that she could not afford not to be. If her ledgers are still here, they might show her financial situation clearly enough to cast doubt on the claim. Rose turned and looked at the farmhouse. Somewhere inside it was her mother's life, 8 months settled into dust and silence. She had been avoiding going through it fully since she arrived, making practical repairs and assessments, and keeping busy in the way you keep busy when the grief is sitting just behind your sternum waiting for a quiet moment to expand. "I will find the ledgers," she said. The ledgers were in a cedar chest at the foot of Clara Quinn's bed, along with a Bible, a small paper-wrapped package of dried lavender, a photograph of Rose at age 7 standing in front of their old house in Missouri, and a letter addressed to Rose in Clara's handwriting, unsealed, as though she had placed it there when she began to understand that she was running out of time. Rose held the letter for a long time without reading it. Then she set it aside carefully and took out the ledgers first, because if she read the letter now, she would not be useful for the rest of the day. The ledgers were indeed meticulous. Clara Quinn had recorded every cent that came in and every cent that went out, in columns so precise they would not have embarrassed a bank clerk. Rose paged through them at the kitchen table while the afternoon light moved across the floor, and what she found was this. In the autumn of 1882, the period during which Decker claimed to have extended the $900 loan, Clara Quinn's financial records showed a property in excellent standing. She had not only not needed $900, she had been 3 months ahead on her land tax payments and had a reserve of over $200 in the Millhaven Bank. She had not needed a loan. She had never taken one. The note was a forgery. Samuel received this news with a grim satisfaction when Rose showed him the ledgers the following morning. "This is what we bring to the attorney," he said. "This is the foundation of the contest. We still need the $60. I have it." Rose looked at him squarely. "Mr. Cooper, I cannot allow you to pay for my legal defense." "You can pay me back when the crop comes in," he said, with a simplicity that made it sound entirely reasonable and not like what it actually was, which was a man extending significant trust to a woman he had known for approximately 48 hours. "You do not know me," Rose said. "I know your mother's ledgers," he said. A woman who kept books like that raised a daughter worth trusting. It was, she thought later while attempting to force the rusted water pump back into working order, a deeply unconventional reason to trust a person. And yet it worked on her like a key in a lock. They rode to Millhaven together on a Thursday, Rose in her best dress, which was clean but showed its age, and Samuel in his Sunday shirt with his jaw freshly shaved. The attorney's office was above the hardware store on the main street, and the attorney, a man named Josiah Greer who had intelligent eyes behind wire spectacles and the general demeanor of someone perpetually exhausted by the number of ways people found to mistreat each other, listened to everything they presented with careful attention. He examined the ledgers. He examined the promissory note, which Decker's lawyer had filed publicly as required. He held the note up to the light from the window for a long moment. "This signature," he said, "your mother's as you knew it. Did she have any particular habits in how she formed certain letters?" "The capital C in Clara," Rose said immediately. "She always made the tail curve upward at the end, like a fish hook." Greer looked at the note again. "The C in this signature curves downward." The relief was so sudden and so physical that Rose had to set both hands flat on Greer's desk to keep herself grounded. Beside her, she heard Samuel exhale slowly. "Can that be demonstrated in court?" Samuel asked. "With comparison samples from her genuine documents, yes," Greer said. "And the financial records are additionally compelling. Taken together, this is a defensible case." He removed his spectacles and polished them with a cloth. "I will be honest with you, Miss Quinn. I have been waiting for someone to bring me a case against Harlan Decker for 3 years. He has been operating in this county with a certainty that no one will challenge him because he controls too much. But that certainty makes him sloppy. This forgery is sloppy." "Then you will take the case?" Rose asked. "I will take the case." He looked at Samuel. "Mr. Cooper, I assume you are prepared to testify about the Quinn land and your knowledge of Clara Quinn's financial independence." "Yes," Samuel said, without hesitation. Rose looked at him then, sideways, in that office above the hardware store in Millhaven, Texas, in April of 1884. He was looking at Greer with that same steady, committed expression he had worn when he rode onto her land, and she felt something shift inside her that was not quite gratitude and not quite admiration, but was something in the family of both, something warmer. She looked away before he could notice. The 30 days became a kind of battle, structured and exhausting and oddly intimate. Rose worked the land during the day with the focus of someone who had something to prove, which she did, because if she was going to stand up in front of a judge and argue that this property was worth saving, she needed to be able to demonstrate that she was actively, seriously working it. She borrowed a mule from Samuel, who refused to call it a loan, and insisted it was simply a neighborly arrangement. She turned the soil in the smaller field and planted corn, working from dawn until the light failed. She repaired the porch boards. She redaubed the walls. She coaxed the vegetable garden back into something intentional. Samuel came every morning with that tin pot of coffee and often stayed to help with whatever was most pressing. They developed a rhythm that surprised her, a natural, unspoken coordination, the kind you usually only see between people who have known each other for years. He did not talk too much or offer opinions she had not asked for. He worked hard and silently beside her, and occasionally made a dry, quiet observation about something that made her laugh before she could stop herself. One afternoon, 3 days into the second week, they were patching the barn roof together. Rose was up on the ladder passing shingles while Samuel nailed them in place from the roof itself, and the wind had been picking up all afternoon and was now genuinely blustering. "Samuel," she called up, testing his given name for the first time and noticing the small pause before he answered. "Yes. If we lose this case, if Decker wins, what happens to you?" Another pause longer. The hammer stopped for a moment. "I stay on my property. I find another water source eventually. It would be difficult but not impossible. So you are not actually in danger of losing your ranch?" "No." "Then you do not need to be here," she said. "You do not have any real stake in this." He came down the ladder past her, and they were briefly at eye level, and he stopped there on the rung, close enough that she could see the lines around his eyes and the particular darkness of his expression, which was not anger exactly but was adjacent to it. "Do not do that," he said quietly. "Do what?" "Try to send me away by making my reason seem thin. I am here because I choose to be here. That is enough of a reason." The wind blew her hair across her face and she pushed it back and held his gaze. "Why do you choose to be here, Samuel?" He was quiet for what felt like a long time. A crow cried somewhere in the cottonwoods by the creek. The wind smelled of approaching rain. "I have not had a reason to get up before dawn for a long time," he said, and then he continued down the ladder before she could respond. She thought about that sentence for the rest of the afternoon, and into the evening and through most of the following morning, turning it over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what lives underneath it. She read her mother's letter that night. She had put it off long enough, and something about the day and the conversation on the ladder, and the way the evening light was coming golden through the farmhouse windows made it feel like the right time, like the kind of softness the moment required. Clara Quinn had written it the previous October, when the cold had started coming, and she could feel her lungs filling despite the medicine the doctor in Millhaven had prescribed. The handwriting was large and careful, the handwriting of someone who knew they were tiring but was determined to make themselves understood. "My Rose," the letter began, "if you are reading this, you have come home to the land I meant to leave you. I hope it is spring when you arrive because the creek in spring is something worth seeing. I want you to know that I am not afraid. I am sorry to leave you the trouble of this property, but I am not sorry for the work of it because every acre of it I broke myself, and it is the most honest thing I have ever owned." Rose pressed her lips together and kept reading. "There is a man on the eastern property named Samuel Cooper. He is a good man. I know this because good men are not common, and when you find one you recognize the quality the way you recognize good wood. He brought me firewood twice last winter without being asked. He fixed the fence on the northern boundary when it went down in the November wind and refused any payment. He is a man who does quiet things without audience, and those are the ones worth knowing. I leave this observation in your hands and trust your judgment." Rose set the letter down on the kitchen table. She sat with it for a long time. Then she folded it carefully, put it back in the envelope, and placed it in the cedar chest on top of the Bible. "I see you, Mama," she said to the quiet room. "I see exactly what you are doing." The court date was set for May the 2nd, which fell on a Thursday, and the 3 weeks leading up to it were a cascade of preparation and anxiety, and beneath all of it, something else that Rose was not yet willing to name. Josiah Greer gathered his documentation with methodical precision. He obtained 5 samples of Clara Quinn's genuine signature from legal documents on file with the county, and from letters that Rose had saved. including 2 she had carried from St. Louis in the bottom of her trunk for no reason. She could clearly articulate except that they were her mother's hand, and she could not leave them behind. Greer also, quietly, began speaking with other Caldwell County landowners who had been through similar experiences with Decker. 2 of them, a man named Augusto Reyes who had lost his eastern pasture 3 years prior, and a widow named Helen Marsh who had settled a Decker debt under considerable pressure in 1881, were willing to come to court and give testimony about the pattern of his behavior. "Pattern is everything," Greer told Rose and Samuel during one of their preparation meetings. "A judge can dismiss a single accusation as misunderstanding. He cannot dismiss a pattern without actively choosing to look the other way, and even the judges who are friendly with Decker have to consider their own reputations." "How friendly is this judge with Decker?" Samuel asked. Greer considered this carefully. "Friendly enough to have played cards at his house. Not friendly enough, I believe, to risk his career over a case where the forgery is as visible as this one is." "You believe," Rose said. "I believe," Greer confirmed. "I do not deal in certainties." "No honest attorney does." Rose appreciated the honesty, even though it kept her awake at night staring at the farmhouse ceiling and listening to the wind outside, and running the odds in her mind over and over in calculations that never quite resolved. On the Saturday before the court date, Samuel arrived later than usual, past 9 in the morning, and when Rose stepped out onto the now-repaired porch, she could see immediately that something was different about him. He was carrying something wrapped in canvas, and his expression had the careful quality of a man approaching a situation he is not certain about. "I brought you something," he said, and held out the canvas package. She took it and unwrapped it. Inside was a small, perfect wooden box about the size of a bread loaf, made from what looked like cedar, with a clean-fitted lid and simple hinge work that was done with real skill. "I made it," he said unnecessarily, "for your mother's letters and documents, the things you want to keep safe. Cedar repels insects and the wood is sound. It will last." Rose held the box and looked at it, and the silence stretched between them for a moment that felt like something balancing on a very fine edge. "Samuel," she said, "it is not a grand gift," he said quickly. "I had the materials and I had the evenings and it seemed practical." "Samuel," she said again, and she looked up at him. "Thank you." He stood on her porch in the Texas morning with his hands at his sides, and returned her gaze, and the particular quality of the stillness between them was different from all the previous silences, which had been comfortable and shared. This one had a charge to it, like the air before a lightning strike. "You are welcome," he said, and turned and went to the barn to work on the fence posts, and Rose stood on her porch holding the cedar box and watching him go, and thought very precisely and deliberately, well. The night before the court date she did not sleep at all. She lay in her mother's bed in the dark farmhouse, and listened to the creek distantly and the nighttime sounds of the Texas spring, and she thought about her mother sitting at the creek's edge in the evenings, and she thought about the 30 days she had just lived through, and she thought about Samuel Cooper arriving on her land with his hands raised, and his 3 unanswered letters, and the willingness to put his own resources on the line for a woman he barely knew because her mother had brought him a pie. She thought about the hidden motive she had suspected initially, the self-interested water access, and how with each passing day it had become harder to maintain that it explained everything. A man protecting his water rights does not come every morning with coffee. A man protecting his water rights does not make cedar boxes in the evenings. A man protecting his water rights does not stop on a ladder rung and say in the voice she was currently hearing clearly in the dark of this bedroom, "I have not had a reason to get up before dawn for a long time." She acknowledged to herself in the honesty that only pure darkness allows, in considerable danger of falling in love with Samuel Cooper. She sat up, put her feet on the cold floor, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and went out to the porch. He was already there. She stopped in the doorway. He was sitting on the porch steps in the moonlight, his arms resting on his knees, looking out at the dark land. He had apparently come sometime in the night to check that everything was secure before the morning, or that was the practical reason, and she was not going to examine any other reason too closely right now. He turned at the sound of her and did not seem surprised. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. She came and sat on the step beside him, a foot of space between them which was simultaneously the most natural and the most charged foot of space she had ever occupied. "What happens if we lose tomorrow?" she asked. "We are not going to lose. But if we did—" He was quiet for a moment. "Then we would find the next thing to do. You are not a person who runs out of options, Rose. You did not ride 40 miles on a rented horse and put a rifle in my face and plant corn in untilled soil and prepare a legal case in 30 days to accept a single setback as the final word." She was startled into a brief laugh. "You make me sound formidable. You are formidable." "I do not feel formidable at midnight on the night before everything that matters goes in front of a judge." "No one feels formidable then," he said. "That is when you just have to be yourself and trust that it is enough." They sat together in the moonlight for a long time, not speaking, and the creek ran somewhere in the dark and the stars were extraordinary, the way they are only in places far enough from towns that the night is genuinely night, and Rose was acutely, specifically, helplessly aware of the warmth of the man sitting a foot away from her. Eventually she said, "My mother wrote about you in her letter." She felt him go very still. "She said you were a good man," Rose continued. "She said you did quiet things without audience." He did not say anything for a while. When he spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "She was a remarkable woman, your mother. The particular brand of courage it takes to come somewhere entirely new and build something from the ground up alone, that is not a common courage." "I think it is more common than we give credit for," Rose said. "I think a lot of people find it when they have to." He turned and looked at her then, and in the moonlight his expression was open in a way she had not seen before, the careful steadiness that was his habitual face replaced by something less guarded, and she held his gaze because she was done looking away from it. "Rose," he said, "Samuel, I have something I want to say to you, and I want to say it before tomorrow because tomorrow will be complicated and I do not want it to be unsaid." "Then say it." He looked at her very directly. "I have spent 3 years on this property alone, working it and maintaining it and being perfectly functional and perfectly empty about it. And then you rode onto this land and pointed a rifle at me, and every morning since then I have had a reason to get up before dawn. And I am telling you this now, the night before your court case, which is perhaps not the ideal moment, but I think you should know that whatever happens tomorrow, the thing I am most grateful for in the last 30 days is not the legal case. It is you." Rose Quinn looked at this man on her porch in the moonlight and felt the thing she had been carefully not naming bloom fully open in her chest with the easy certainty of something that had already been growing for some time. "Samuel Cooper," she said, "you are going to make this extremely difficult to concentrate on tomorrow." "I know," he said. "I am sorry." "No, you are not." The faintest smile crossed his face, quiet and real, and she felt it like a match being struck somewhere warm and central. "No," he agreed. "I am not." She reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, just her hand on his. And they sat like that in the moonlight until the horizon began to lighten from black to the deep blue that precedes dawn. And then Rose went inside to get dressed, and Samuel went home to do the same. And neither of them said anything more because everything necessary had been said. The courthouse in Millhaven was a solid limestone building that smelled of dust and old paper and the particular gravity of official proceedings. It was not large, but it was well attended on the morning of May the 2nd, 1884, because word had spread through the county the way words spread in small communities where people are quietly hungry for the tides to turn, and the benches were full by the time Rose took her seat beside Josiah Greer at the plaintiff's table. Harlan Decker sat across the aisle with his attorney, a man from San Antonio named Pierce who wore an expensive suit and had the manner of someone accustomed to winning on technicality. Decker himself was a large man in his 50s, red-faced and prosperous-looking, with the easy confidence of a person who had not been seriously challenged in years. He did not look at Rose when she entered. He did not need to. She was, in his calculation, an obstacle of no particular weight. Samuel sat in the first row of the public benches directly behind Rose. She did not look back at him, but she could feel him there the way you can feel a fire in a room, not intrusively, but as a warmth that is simply part of the environment. The judge, a man named Caleb Whitmore, was in his late 60s and had the exhausted dignity of a man who had seen too much to be impressed by any of it. He called the proceedings to order with a single rap of his gavel and directed both parties to present their cases. Pierce went first, laying out Decker's claim with polished efficiency. The loan, the promissory note, the outstanding debt, the property as collateral, which had been, he argued, the explicit agreement between Decker and the late Clara Quinn. He was smooth and organized and presented the forged note as Exhibit A with the confidence of a man who expected it to be the end of the matter. Then Josiah Greer stood up. Greer was not polished. He was methodical. He presented the Quinn financial ledgers. He presented the 5 authenticated samples of Clara Quinn's genuine signature. He called a handwriting expert, a retired postal inspector from Austin who had agreed, after seeing the documents, to travel to Millhaven for his standard fee plus expenses, who testified with calm precision about the specific differences in the letter formations, the pressure patterns, the particular upward curl of the capital C that appeared in every genuine sample and was absent from the promissory note. Then he called Augusto Reyes, who described in careful, plain language how Decker's representative had approached him in 1881 about a small cattle dispute on a common boundary, how the dispute had somehow transformed into a debt claim, and how he had eventually been left with no practical option but to sign over the eastern pasture. His voice was quiet and steady, and he did not look at Decker once. Then he called Helen Marsh, the widow, who was 60 years old with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a long time. She described her own experience with Decker's pattern of manufactured financial pressure in language so specific and so composed that the courtroom was absolutely silent. Pierce objected repeatedly. Judge Whitmore sustained some objections and overruled others, and his expression gave nothing away. Finally, Greer called Samuel Cooper. Samuel took the stand and answered questions in the same direct, unhurried manner he did everything. He described his property's location relative to the Quinn land. He described his years of regular contact with Clara Quinn. He described, specifically, a conversation he had had with Clara in the summer of 1882, 3 months before the date on the forged promissory note, in which she had mentioned proudly that she was for the first time in 2 years comfortable with her financial situation and would be making improvements to her barn from her own savings, without any outside assistance. He said the words, "without any outside assistance," with a particular quiet emphasis, and then looked directly at Decker, and Decker looked at his attorney, and Judge Whitmore looked at the ceiling for a moment. Pierce cross-examined Samuel with the practiced aggression of a man who charges high fees for his confrontational manner, and Samuel answered every question with the same unhurried calm and did not become flustered or angry or defensive, which seemed to frustrate Pierce considerably. When it was done, Greer made his closing arguments, which were concise and logical. Then Pierce made his, which were long and elaborate and involved several references to the importance of respecting legally filed documentation, which Rose noticed Judge Whitmore appeared to be listening to with the patience of someone waiting for a particular thing to be over. Then Judge Whitmore called a recess. Rose sat in the hallway outside the courtroom on a wooden bench and did not speak and barely moved for 45 minutes. Samuel sat beside her for some of it. Then he stood and walked to the window and looked out at the main street of Millhaven and then came back. Greer reviewed his notes in a focused silence. Augusto Reyes and Helen Marsh sat together on a bench across the hall and spoke quietly in Spanish, and Rose caught enough of it to understand that Helen was saying she had not expected to feel this relieved just from the saying of it. When the door opened and the clerk called them back in, Rose walked back to her seat with both hands steady and her chin up, and a feeling in her chest that was neither hope nor dread, but simply a readiness for whatever came, the kind of readiness that comes from having done everything possible and being prepared to live with the result. Judge Whitmore sat for a long moment looking at the papers before him. Then he said, "The evidence presented in this case is sufficient, in my judgment, to create serious doubt about the validity of the promissory note filed by the plaintiff. The handwriting analysis is credible. The financial records of the deceased are comprehensive and directly contradict the claim. The testimony of Mr. Cooper and the two additional witnesses establishes a pattern of similar claims that this court cannot in good conscience overlook. The claim of Harlan Decker against the Quinn property is dismissed. The property stands in the name of Rose Quinn, sole heir to Clara Quinn, as legally registered." He brought the gavel down. The sound of it was the most satisfying sound Rose had ever heard in her life. She sat for a moment and did not move. Then Greer was squeezing her arm and saying something she could not quite process through the sudden rushing in her ears, and she turned around and Samuel was standing up in the first row, and his expression was the open, unguarded one she had seen in the moonlight. And she stood up and without thinking about it, without calculating or hesitating, she crossed the small space between them and put both her arms around him, and he wrapped his around her. And she pressed her forehead against his shoulder for a moment that was brief and private and complete. She felt him exhale, long and slow, against her hair. "All right," he said very quietly. "We are all right." Decker's attorney was already talking to him in urgent tones in the corner of the courtroom. Decker's red face had gone a color deeper and less healthy, and he was not looking at Rose at all, which was a kind of acknowledgment in itself. He filed a formal appeal 3 weeks later. Greer responded with additional documentation. The appeal was denied by the circuit court in Austin in August. Decker, without the water access he had been seeking, sold 200 acres of his eastern pasture to cover the costs of 2 new wells, and never directly approached Rose Quinn or her property again. It was not, as Greer said dryly when he delivered the news of the appeal denial, a man who had been reformed. It was a man who had been made to understand that a certain avenue was closed. Rose decided that was enough. The summer of 1884 settled over Caldwell County with the full weight and heat of a Texas July, and Rose Quinn worked her land with a joy she had not expected to feel, the kind of joy that comes from doing hard things and having them mean something. The corn came up strong in the smaller field. The vegetable garden behind the house became genuinely productive, and she developed a daily habit of bringing a basket of whatever was ripe to the general store in Millhaven to sell, which gave her small, regular income, and the satisfaction of watching what her own hands produced become useful in the world. She repaired the larger field and planted a late crop of sorghum, which would be ready by September. She acquired 2 laying hens from the Reyes family, who had become genuine friends in the aftermath of the court case, and whose 3 children occasionally appeared at her fence to regard her farm animals with enormous eyes. She fixed the cracked window pane. She painted the farmhouse's exterior wall with a whitewash she mixed herself, working in the early mornings before the heat peaked, and stood back afterward and looked at it and felt her mother's presence very specifically and very warmly. Samuel came every day. It was simply a fact of her life now, like the sunrise and the creek and the sound of the wind in the cottonwoods. He came with coffee in the morning and helped with whatever needed 2 pairs of hands and stayed through the middle of the day and went home in the late afternoon to his own property, which she understood required his attention, and which she had begun visiting regularly for the entirely practical reason of returning tools and borrowing others and not, she told herself, for the view from his porch, which was very fine, or for the way he looked in his work shirt on a Tuesday morning with his hat tipped back on his head and a particular light in his dark eyes when she arrived. They were, by the end of June, more honest with each other than Rose had been with anyone since her mother. She told him about St. Louis, about the years of seamstress work and the cold rented room, and the way she had lived in a state of ongoing preparation for a future that kept being slightly ahead of where she was. He told her about where he had come from, which was a small farm in Tennessee where he had grown up as the youngest of 4 boys, and the long way he had made to Texas after the war had changed everything the way the war changed everything, and the years he had spent working other people's cattle operations before saving enough to buy his own land. "You said you have been here alone for 3 years," she said one evening. They were sitting on the fence rails at the western boundary watching the light go over the creek. Before that, he was quiet for a moment. "There was someone in Tennessee before I came west. We were to be married, and she decided she could not wait for me to come back from the Western Territories, which was her right to decide." "Were you hurt?" "For a time," he said honestly. "And then I understood that she was right to know her own mind and that the hurt was mostly about my own expectations and not about her. She married a man who stayed in Tennessee and was happy, by all accounts. I came to Texas and built something I am proud of. It resolved itself." She looked at him sideways. "You have a very rational way of thinking about painful things." "Or I am an extremely good liar," he said, and the dry humor of it made her laugh. "What about you?" he asked, returning the question with the fairness that characterized most of what he did. "No one," she said, and it was simple and true. "I was always working toward the next thing. There was not much space for anything else." "And now?" he asked quietly. She turned and looked at him in the evening light by the creek that her mother had loved, and the summer was warm around them, and the cottonwoods were breathing in the light breeze, and she was exactly herself, full and real and present in a way she had not been in a long time. "And now," she said, "I find that there is considerably more space than I expected." He looked at her with that open expression that she had learned to read, the one that said he was about to be honest in a way that cost him something. "Rose," he said, "I would like to ask if I may court you properly." The formality of it in the Texas dusk on a fence rail was so earnest and so characteristically him that she felt a tenderness for him so acute it was almost painful. "Samuel Cooper," she said, "you have been bringing me coffee every morning for 3 months and making me cedar boxes and sitting on my porch in the middle of the night. I believe the courting is already somewhat underway. I wanted to be clear about my intentions," he said, with great dignity. "Your intentions are quite clear," she said. "Yes, yes, yes, you may court me properly." He smiled then, the real full smile she had seen occasionally but not often, and it changed his face entirely, taking away the years and the weathering and leaving something purely delighted underneath. And she thought, watching it, that she was in very deep trouble and was entirely at peace with this. July became August, and August moved toward September with the specific quality of late Texas summer, brutal and golden, and Samuel courted Rose with the same careful, earnest attention he brought to everything he did. He brought wildflowers, which grew in the rocky corners of both their properties and cost nothing but the time to gather them, which made them feel more honest than purchased ones. He took her to the Saturday social in Millhaven, which was a modest affair in the church hall with a fiddle player and a caller and a great deal of lemonade, and danced with her in a way that made it quite clear he had not danced recently, but was committed to doing it properly. He took her riding along the creek on a Sunday, both of them on horseback, going slowly in the shade of the cottonwoods, talking about everything and nothing. He introduced her to his horses with a pride that she found entirely endearing, 3 of them, working horses all, but named with a specificity that indicated he spent considerable time with them. Drummond, the gray gelding she already knew, a bay mare named November, given the name because he had bought her on the first day of that month, and a small roan called Particular, whose name she did not ask about because some names were clearly self-explanatory. In September, the sorghum was ready and Rose hired two of the Ray's boys, aged 17 and 19, to help with the harvest, and paid them fairly and fed them lunch. And by the end of 3 days, the crop was in, and her financial picture had changed considerably. She paid Samuel back the $60 for Greer's fee with a formality she insisted on, and he accepted with a grace that made it feel like an act of respect rather than a transaction. She had begun to make her mother's house fully her own in small ways, not erasing Clara's presence but adding her own beside it, a second personality in the space, younger and different but continuous. She hung her own shawl on the hook next to where her mother's winter coat still hung, which she could not yet take down. She added a small shelf beside the window for her books, which were not many but were chosen. She planted roses along the south wall of the house, which was a perhaps too obvious personal marker, but which also would bloom spectacularly the following spring, and which her mother, she felt certain, would have approved. On a Sunday afternoon in late September, sitting on the repaired and painted porch in the early autumn warmth, Rose read while Samuel worked on a piece of harness he had brought over that needed mending, and the ordinary beauty of the moment was so particular that she looked up from her book and said, without planning to, "I think I am in love with you." Samuel stopped working on the harness. He set it down on the porch boards and turned to look at her, and his expression was doing several things at once, all of them intense. "I thought I should say it plainly," Rose said. "You seem to appreciate plainness." "Rose, you have been very patient, and I do not want you to be patient indefinitely, while I take my time deciding something I already know." He stood up and came to where she was sitting and looked down at her, and then sat on the edge of the porch rail facing her, and they were close enough that she could see the specific dark gray and brown of his eyes in the afternoon light. "I have been in love with you," he said, with great precision, "since approximately the second morning when you handed me my empty coffee tin back with both your hands wrapped in cloth because your blisters had opened in the night, and you were still going to work the field and thought I would not notice." Rose stared at him. "That was in the first week." "Yes. Samuel Cooper, you have been walking around being in love with me for 5 months and only asked to court me in July. I did not want to press," he said with immense dignity. "You are a deeply restrained human being," she said. "I have been told." She reached out and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, and they sat like that in the September afternoon with the Texas sky enormous and blue above them, and the creek just barely audible at the property's edge, and neither of them spoke for a while, because nothing needed to be said right now that was more important than what was already happening. Then she said, "What do we do now?" "I have some thoughts," he said. "Tell me." He looked at her steadily. "I would like to marry you, Rose, if you are willing. Not immediately if you are not ready. Not for any reason of practicality, though there are practical reasons and I am not going to pretend there are not. But because I want to build something with you specifically, the way you build things when you intend them to last." Rose Quinn looked at this man who had ridden onto her land 4 months ago with his hands raised, and his 3 unanswered letters, and his 6 years of quiet solitude that he had given up every morning without question to bring her coffee and work beside her. And she thought about her mother sitting at the creek's edge in the evenings, and she thought about what a person builds when they intend it to last, and she understood with complete clarity that she was not falling anymore. She had already landed. She had landed quietly somewhere in the first weeks and had simply been in the process of recognizing where she was. "Yes," she said. "Yes. Yes, Samuel, I will marry you." He exhaled slowly, and then he was smiling, the full real smile again, and he brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles with a formality that was also genuine tenderness. And she laughed and leaned forward and kissed him, brief and warm and sure. And he kissed her back with a careful intensity that said clearly this was something he intended to do with a great deal of attention for a long time. They were married on the 15th of October, 1884, in the Millhaven Church by the same preacher who had buried Clara Quinn the previous November, who told Rose afterward that this was his favorite kind of service to perform, and that he believed her mother would have been very happy. The ceremony was small. Greer attended, and the Ray's family, and Helen Marsh, and a handful of neighbors who had come to know Rose over the summer and considered themselves invested in her well-being. Samuel had one friend from the early days of his ranch, a rancher named Thomas Aldrich, who had ridden 2 days to attend, and who spent the reception gripping Samuel's hand and looking at Rose with the expression of a man who had been worried about his friend for several years and was relieved to see a particular variety of worry resolved. Rose wore her best dress, which she had remade over the preceding 3 weeks into something more suited to the occasion, adding a lace collar she had purchased from Mrs. Abernathy's store, and spending 3 evenings on the careful work of it. Her seamstress training finally applied to something that was entirely and specifically hers. She carried a small bunch of the late-season wildflowers that still grew along the creek. Standing at the front of the church, looking at Samuel in his best suit, which fit him well and clearly had not been worn for some considerable time given the slight awkwardness with which he inhabited it, Rose felt the full weight and beauty of the moment. This was her land and her choice and her life, built from the ground up the way her mother had built things, with honest work and clear eyes and the willingness to let something good happen when it arrived. They said their vows in plain, clear voices, and the church was very still. After the ceremony, walking back out into the October afternoon, Samuel took her hand in that steady way he had and said nothing, and she held his hand back and said nothing, and it was the best conversation she had ever had. They lived on Rose's property. This had been her suggestion and Samuel's immediate agreement, and between them they made it work with a practical efficiency that impressed even themselves. His ranch was leased to a young family newly arrived in the county who needed land and were prepared to work it properly, which gave Samuel income from that direction, while he invested his labor in what had become theirs. The barn got a new roof entirely, not just a patch, over the course of 3 weekends in October and November when the weather was still cooperative. A second field was broken and prepared for spring planting. The farmhouse acquired, over several months, the particular warmth of a genuinely inhabited home, the accumulation of 2 lives lived together in a space, books beside tools, a second coffee mug on the shelf, boots of 2 different sizes by the door. The first winter was cold and occasionally fierce and entirely excellent. They learned each other in the way that people who live and work together learn each other, not through conversations alone, but through the texture of daily life, the way a person moves in the early morning before they are fully awake, the way they respond to difficulty, what they find funny, what they find hard, what they reach for when they need comfort. Rose discovered that Samuel talked more than she had initially assessed, the quiet exterior concealing a mind that was consistently engaged and occasionally quite surprising in its range. He had read widely, borrowing books from whoever had them and working through them systematically, and could hold a conversation on topics from agricultural chemistry to the history of the westward expansion that were not always found in the same person. Samuel discovered that Rose had a temper that was rare but volcanic when genuinely provoked, that she could go from perfectly composed to absolutely furious in approximately 3 seconds when she encountered a specific variety of injustice, and that she cried precisely twice, once when the first November frost killed the last of her garden, and once when she found, in the bottom of her mother's cedar chest, a small pair of shoes that had been Rose's at age 4, saved for no reason except love. He held her the second time, sitting on the edge of the bed in Clara's room, and said nothing because there was nothing useful to say and he was wise enough to know it, and she cried into his shoulder and then stopped and said, "She kept everything," and he said, "Yes," and they sat together for a while in the room that had been her mother's until it was not sad anymore and was instead simply full. In February of 1885, Rose told Samuel she was expecting. They were at the breakfast table, the winter light coming thin and gray through the kitchen window, and she had been trying for 2 days to decide how to say it and had eventually concluded that with Samuel there was never any method better than simply saying the thing. He went very still in the way he went still when something mattered enormously, and then he looked at her with an expression so unguarded and so radiantly joyful that she felt it physically. "Rose," he said, "I know. Are you well?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also, apparently, going to need a great deal of help with the spring planting." He laughed, which she had been hoping for, and came around the table and gathered her into his arms and held her there in the kitchen in the February morning, and she pressed her face against his neck and felt entirely, completely held. The spring of 1885 was magnificent, the way springs are in a good year when the rains come right and the soil is ready. The fields came up with a vigor that felt like endorsement. The roses Rose had planted along the south wall bloomed in late April in a deep, specific pink that she had not known to expect, and which turned out to be a variety her mother had apparently planted years before that had gone dormant and come back with renewed determination. They covered half the wall by the first week of May and smelled extraordinary in the evenings. They had help now. The Ray's family came for the major plantings, and Rose and Augusto's wife Carmen had become genuine friends over the winter, the kind of friendship that develops when two women recognize in each other a particular quality of bone-deep competence and find it restful. Carmen's 3 children, ranging in age from 7 to 17, treated the Quinn Cooper farm as a second home with the ease of children who are welcome everywhere they go. Rose managed the property through her pregnancy with the same organized determination she brought to everything, adapting as necessary but not stopping, which the doctor in Millhaven said was perfectly appropriate for a healthy woman doing reasonable work, and Rose defined reasonable according to her own assessment, which generally satisfied her. Samuel, for his part, was attentive in the specific, useful way that characterized everything he did. He took over the heavier work without being asked, and without making a point of it. He kept the coffee hot, and the wood stack full. He sat with her in the evenings on the porch in the warm spring nights and put his hand over her hand on her lap and was simply present, the way being present is the most profound thing a person can offer. In the hottest week of July, with the Texas summer at its most absolute, their son was born. The labor was long and Carmen was there, and the doctor from Millhaven, and Samuel paced the length of the porch approximately 10,000 times by Rose's later estimate. And at 2 o'clock in the morning on the 17th of July, 1885, a boy was born healthy and fierce, and loudly objecting to the entire situation. Samuel came into the room, and Rose was exhausted and entirely alive, and she placed the baby into his arms and watched him look at this small, furious, real new person, and the expression on his face was unlike any she had seen before, overwhelming and specific. A man encountering something he had perhaps given up expecting and receiving it fully. "Hello," Samuel said to the baby very quietly, and the baby stopped crying for a moment and regarded him with the profound, unfocused concentration of the newly arrived. "His name," Rose said from the pillow, "is Thomas, for your friend who rode 2 days to our wedding because that is the kind of friendship worth commemorating." Samuel looked up at her and his eyes were bright and full. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas James Cooper," she said. "James was my grandfather's name." He brought the baby back to her and sat on the edge of the bed, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the baby, Thomas James Cooper, settled between them with the complete unconscious trust of the very new. "Clara would have loved this," Rose said. "Yes," Samuel said, "she would have." They were quiet together for a while with the baby and the summer night coming through the window and the crickets enormous in the dark outside. "Samuel," Rose said, "thank you. For what specifically? For riding onto my land," she said. "For not turning around when I pointed a rifle at you." He laughed softly against her hair. "I considered it. But you did not." "No," he said, "I did not." Thomas was a child of remarkable character from an early age. inheriting his mother's directness and his father's stillness in a combination that made him simultaneously very easy to love and quite difficult to fool. He walked at 10 months and began issuing opinions, in his own fashion, shortly thereafter. By the time he was 2, he was following Samuel around the farm with the dedicated attention of a person enrolled in an intensive course of study, and Samuel taught him the names of tools and the habits of horses and the principles of soil, with the patience of a man who considered this the most important work he did. Rose watched them together, in the mornings when the light was coming up over the fields and Samuel was showing Thomas how to hold a fence post while he worked the wire, and felt something so complete and so full that it occasionally took her breath. She kept her mother's land. She kept it carefully, with both hands, the way her mother had always intended. She planted and harvested and repaired and improved with the focused joy of someone who understands that the thing they are tending is both practical and sacred, a piece of ground that holds a history and is being asked to hold a future. In the autumn of 1886, Josiah Greer sent a letter informing Rose that Harlan Decker's bank had been found to be involved in a pattern of fraudulent lending practices that extended considerably beyond his activities in Caldwell County. A federal investigation, prompted in part by documentation that Greer had been quietly compiling and forwarding to the appropriate authorities for 2 years, had resulted in Decker's bank being placed under receivership, and Decker himself facing charges that would occupy his considerable attention for the foreseeable future. Rose read this letter at the kitchen table and then folded it very precisely and went and placed it in the cedar box Samuel had made her, alongside her mother's letter and the legal documents and the deed to the Quinn land, now also in Rose's name. She pressed her hand flat on the top of the box for a moment. "Finished," she said to the empty kitchen, meaning it in both directions, both the threat and the grief, the two things that had arrived together and were now together resolved. By 1887, the farm was producing reliably, and Rose had established a small regular trade relationship with the general store and one of the Millhaven restaurants, supplying produce and preserves with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had learned from her mother's ledgers that financial stability was built in small, consistent, carefully recorded steps. She kept her own ledgers with the same meticulous hand Clara had used, and found in the keeping of them something that was not merely practical but reverential, a continuation of her mother's way of moving through the world with clear eyes and honest accounts. Samuel leased his original ranch property to the young family for another 2 years and then, in 1888, sold it to them outright at a fair price, because by that point the Quinn Cooper farm was large enough and productive enough that the ranch was redundant and the young family needed it, had been building their life on it, and deserved to own the ground under their feet. It was Samuel's way of doing things, quiet, practical, generous without performance. He invested the proceeds from the sale in improving the Quinn Cooper property. They broke a third field. They replaced the barn entirely with a larger, better-designed structure that Rose had drawn plans for over the course of a winter, and which they built over 6 weeks in the early spring of 1889 with help from half the neighbors in the county, because that was how building was done, with community, each family contributing labor that would be reciprocated when their own need arose. Rose was expecting their second child by the time the new barn was completed, and she announced it at the raising celebration with the straightforward joy of someone who had fully inhabited their own life and found it exactly sufficient. This time it was a girl. She was born in November of 1889, small and precise and extremely clear about her preferences from the first week, and they named her Clara Rose Cooper. Clara for Rose's mother and Rose because Rose had decided that her own name was worth continuing, and Cooper because she was fully and happily and permanently a Cooper in the way that mattered, which had nothing to do with what name was written in the ledger, and everything to do with the life they were all building together in Caldwell County. Texas, on the land that Clara Quinn had bought with years of other people's laundry, and her own indomitable, stubborn, far-seeing hope. Thomas, who was 4 when his sister arrived, regarded her with a mixture of fascination and suspicion that gradually resolved itself into a fierce, proprietary affection over the course of her first year. And by the time she was walking, he followed her around the farm, reversing Samuel's role. Now the elder one teaching, now the one showing where to step and what to touch and how to approach the horses. And Rose watched this from the porch and felt her mother everywhere, in the work and the love and the careful, deliberate passing on of what one generation had learned to the next. In the spring of 1890, Rose sat at the creek's edge in the evening the way her mother used to sit there. The cottonwoods were in their pale new leaves again, the precise color she had noticed on the first day she walked this land with Samuel, and the water was running clear and cold over the stones, and the evening was soft around her. Samuel came and sat beside her. Thomas was in the barn doing something with Drummond. Clara was asleep in the house, watched by Carmen, Reyes's eldest daughter, who had become their most trusted neighbor's helper. It was quiet in the way that evenings on working land are quiet, full of small sounds but free of urgency. "What are you thinking?" Samuel asked. "I am thinking about my mother," Rose said. "I come here sometimes and I feel like she is still sitting here. Like the place remembers her." "Places do," Samuel said. "Things that have been loved change." She looked at him. He was looking at the water, his profile in the evening light showing his age now, the years since she arrived on this land having settled into him in ways that were somehow exactly right, like the weathering on good wood that Greer had described her mother recognizing as worth knowing. "Samuel," she said. "Yes. You told me the night before the court case that you had not had a reason to get up before dawn for a long time. I remember. I want you to know," she said, "that you are my reason, that you have been my reason every morning for 6 years. I want you to know that plainly, so there is no question." He turned and looked at her, and his expression was the open, unguarded one she loved best in him, the one that had been there on the ladder and on the porch step and in the courthouse, and in that kitchen on the February morning when she told him about Thomas. And it was there now, fully, without reservation. He reached over and took her hand the way he always took it, with the simple certainty of someone who had learned where they belonged. "I know," he said. "I have always known." They sat together at the creek as the light went down over the Quinn Cooper land, the 6 acres of corn and the field of sorghum, and the vegetable garden and the white farmhouse with the roses along its south wall and the new barn and the horses moving in the evening pasture and the 2 children inside, one asleep and one learning the names of things in the careful company of his father's gray gelding, and the cottonwoods breathing above the water in the soft last of the light. The creek ran. The land held. The evening was full and warm and entirely real. Everything that had come before, the grief and the rifle and the 30 days of terror, and the forged note, and the courtroom and the long, slow, beautiful work of building a life in the correct company, had been the story of how they arrived here, the story of a woman who came to work the land her mother left her, and found the man who would not let her fall, who had in fact been waiting at the edge of her grief with coffee and steadiness and 3 unanswered letters and the patient certainty of someone who knew what was worth showing up for. And they were here now, both of them, together. Thomas James Cooper came out of the barn in the last of the light and crossed the yard to his parents, and pushed himself between them on the creek bank with the unconscious confidence of a child who has never doubted his welcome. And Rose put her arm around his shoulders, and Samuel put his arm around hers, and the 3 of them sat at the water's edge while the stars came out, one by one, over Caldwell County, Texas, in the spring of 1890. And the land kept its name, which was Quinn by origin and Cooper by addition, and theirs by the only authority that finally mattered. The long proof of the working of it, and the love that had been grown in its soil alongside everything else, just as stubbornly and just as permanently, taking root in the ground that Clara Quinn had bought with hope, and her daughter had kept with courage, and that would be passed to Thomas and to Clara Rose and to whoever came after them, for as many years as there was someone willing to show up before dawn and work it with both hands and mean it. Which, in the Cooper family, turned out to be a very long time indeed.